The three pillars upon which modern Australia rests are the Indigenous heritage, the British Foundation and the immigrant character. But when all is said and done, Aboriginal people are less than 4% of our population.
You'd have to say, though, that I think we've been overwhelmingly a British society. I don't think we live in a culture anymore where people appreciate the effort that went into them, how carefully thought through and argued and fought over the institutions of our freedom actually were. A people deprived of their history are easily persuaded.
The vast majority of contemporary Australian historiography obsesses over Indigenous issues. Our foundational ethos remains, as I hope it always will, Judeo-Christian.
When politicians appeal to Australian values, I sometimes wonder what they mean, because an awful lot of them, frankly, play to our differences, not the things we have in common.
It dismays me so many of our businesses have subcontracted out so many parts of our critical supply chains to communist China.
Are we still the lucky country? It's a pleasure to talk to Tony Abbott about his new book, Australia, A History. It's a really serious work. Tony and I were contemporaries at university. He went on to become a Rhodes Scholar, a member of the Federal Parliament, and became Australia's 28th Prime Minister. Well, Tony Abbott, great to be with you again and to have another conversation.
John, it's an honour to be with you for my second conversation. And
third, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
Of course, it's our third conversation.
Yes, it is.
And so I guess I must be now one of your regulars.
Absolutely.
Victor Davis Hanson is on a lot. I haven't quite caught up with him.
But there's a big challenge in this for me. You and I were roughly contemporaries at university. You studied
Economics law.
And I studied Master of Arts in Australian history, but you're the one who's written the authoritative history of Australia.
You've made plenty of history though, John.
Oh,
that's pretty important.
Not as much as you have. But it's great to be with you. Now, this is quite a book. It is, I'm going to say that without reservation. And, you know, really, when Britain's senior historian, Andrew Roberts, writes that this is superbly researched, scrupulously fair-minded, and very engagingly written, this is big narrative history at its best. So I just want to say, well done. And to our listeners, put this on your list for your Christmas shopping, distribute it widely, because history matters. Why does history matter?
Well, history matters because if you don't know where your country has been, it's very hard to understand where it is, and it's almost impossible to create the best possible future. I mean, if we didn't know anything about our parents and grandparents, we would be adrift as people. And it's a bit like that for nations. And part of the problem, John, right now, is that very few of us are familiar with our history. Just last night, I was talking to two 30-ish people who are very close to me, and I asked one of them who was the first governor of New South Wales. He had to think long and hard before telling me, was it someone Phillip? And then I asked the other who was the first Prime Minister, and she had to think long and hard before she said, was it Barton, somebody or other? Now, okay, I guess our first Prime Minister only served for about 18 months, was perhaps in the shade of Alfred Deakin, our most significant early Prime Minister. But you'd really think that the name of our first Prime Minister would be on the tip of most Australians' tongues. And Arthur Phillip was really our equivalent of George Washington. And it's hard to imagine an American who wouldn't instantly be able to tell you about George Washington. Yet I suspect far more Australians would know more about George Washington than they do about Governor Arthur Phillip.
What gave you your love of history? Because it's not just this book. It goes back a long time into your early life.
Well, John, I was very lucky. I mean, I had wonderful parents, and my dad was very insistent that I should try to seek the good in others, because that's the best way to get on as well as you can with other people. And my mum, who's still with us, God bless her, she would routinely bring home for me when I was 8, 9, 10 years old, the Ladybird books that were then quite well known. And there was a whole series of Ladybird books about the great people who had shaped history, but British history in particular. So I can remember as a youngster reading books about Julius Caesar, about Alexander the Great, about Richard the Lionheart, about Nelson, about Wellington. And naturally, one was curious, uplifted, inspired to want to do great things and to regard these individuals as having done great things. See, you and I have lived, John, the difference that individuals can make. I mean, if John Howard hadn't been the leader of the government in which we both served, it would have been a very different government, and I suspect a lesser government. If Winston Churchill had not been around in 1940, the whole fate of the world could have been different. Just at the moment, the character and personality of the American president, for better or for worse, and I think more for better than for worse, is making a huge difference. I mean, the world is changed for better or for worse by individuals and the choices that they make. And that was activated in me very early, thanks to my mum. It was further fostered when I was at school by my great mentor, Father Emmett Costello, who was always encouraging me to read intensively and extensively in biography. And I mean, the human factor in history is far more important than economics, impersonal historical forces. I'm not saying that these things don't matter, but in the end, it's what individual human beings do in small things and in big things that really make the difference.
I can relate to that. I think for me, we didn't have TV out in the bush where I was until I was basically, almost a teenager. So you read, and heroes were very important to me. I can remember, Robin Hood and King Arthur, and then you move on to Captain Cook. Dare I say it? No, he was the bloke who discovered Australia, wasn't he? Settled Australia.
Yeah, that's right.
Some people think.
That's right. Yeah.
And it grew. I remember the extraordinary front page headlines when Churchill died, and asking my father about Churchill, because my father had fought in the war. Churchill himself had commented that any culture, any society that doesn't pass on to its young the stories of its faith, its beliefs, and its heroes, will leave its young people without a sense of place, purpose, and direction.
Read history, said Churchill, for therein lie all the secrets of statecraft.
Yeah, and the further you want to see into the future, the further you need to look to the past. But just on that point of not having television in this media age, and here are you and I talking about history on a podcast, why read books?
Because imagine a pre-literate society. I mean, imagine our societies when they were pre-literate. They were vastly less good at everything. It was literacy that enabled education. It was literacy that enabled the rise of science. It was literacy that empowered technology. Perhaps one of the downsides of AI is going to be the conversion of works of literature into, I guess, AI-powered speech. And it may be possible at one level for people to get by without being literate. Now, I think this would be an absolutely retrograde step. I mean, I know myself that if I don't write I don't adequately analyse my own thoughts. I don't adequately marshal my arguments. I don't adequately consider the counter-arguments and different propositions and so on. And without being literate, you can't even begin to do this. So yeah, I mean, literacy, a well-stocked mind, extensive reading in the best that's been thought and said is critically important for the well-being of our societies now and forever.
All agreed, but now you've made the entirely relevant point that history is about understanding where you've come from so you can work out where you are, gives you some shot at the future. I'd suggest there's something more, if I may, and that is this: a people deprived of their history are easily persuaded. Karl Marx.
And it's unsurprising that the cultural Marxists who now abound in our universities and whose ideas have permeated our education systems want to abandon history or distort it. And the vast majority of contemporary Australian historiography obsesses over Indigenous issues. Now, I think that our Indigenous heritage is a very important part of our overall story. I say in the book that the three pillars upon which modern Australia rests are the Indigenous heritage, the British Foundation, and the immigrant character. But when all is said and done, Aboriginal people are less than 4% of our population currently, and it's not the whole story. Not only is it not the whole story, but the story of Indigenous Australia is not all a bad story. I mean, yes, you've got Pemulwuy the warrior, who was symbolic of the resistance to the settlement, but you've got Bennelong the conciliator, who was symbolic of the cooperation with the settlement. And all the way through, there have been Aboriginal people who have, I suppose, engaged with settler Australia because they've appreciated that A, it's the present and the future, and B, there's actually a lot for them in this, because while we do know about the conflict on the frontier, while we do know that there was paternalism and even racism in early modern Australia, what also came ashore in 1788 was the rule of law, concepts of the equality of all human beings, scientific progress, modernity came ashore in 1788. And in the long run, that's been very good for Aboriginal people as well as for everyone else who lives in modern Australia.
Good point in the conversation to make the observation that the commendations of the book and my own experience reading it is that you seek to be scrupulously fair and honest about these things, and that's been acknowledged by people from the other side of politics and powerfully pointed to in the foreword by Geoffrey Blaney, who says that people will be surprised at your lack of animosity and point scoring in relation to those who might have a different perspective. But to drill into what you've just said about the rule of law, I have a young man of my acquaintance. He's in his very early years in the education system in Australia, and he came home quite distressed the other day because he'd been told that for many decades the Aboriginal people were classified under the Native Flora and Fauna Act. A quick search reveals that even the ABC will tell you no such act has ever existed.
Correct.
And yet this is being taught right now in a school that actually has quite a good reputation in the very state that you and I are in. And it's a terrible, terrible message, and it's not true.
No. I mean, what I tried to do in writing the book is face up to the known horrors, but not to get caught up in the merely speculative horrors. Now, the first massacre that we know about was in the early 1800s when Governor Macquarie sent a detachment of troops to sort of scour the Cumberland Plain in a bid to reduce the violence against the settlers on the then frontier in the Hawkesbury Valley. And sadly, there was an encounter, an early morning encounter between troops and a group of Indigenous people, and we think up to 20 may have been killed. Governor Macquarie wrote to London about this, and there was some dispute as to whether the troops were attacked or whether they simply opened fire. It doesn't reflect particularly well on anyone, I've got to say, this incident. Then, of course, there was the dreadful, dreadful atrocity of the Myall Creek Massacre, where a party of stockmen attacked an Aboriginal encampment and killed up to 30, wantonly butchered up to 30 Aboriginal people. And in the Sky Doco, I speak with Nathan Blacklock and his brother, who are the descendants of a survivor of that atrocious massacre. Now, in the aftermath of the massacre, Governor Gipps and his Attorney General, the wonderful John Plunkett, who deserves to be much better known to modern Australia, they determined that there had to be an investigation. And after some weeks, the accused were brought to Sydney for trial. The jury initially refused to convict. Plunkett, showing great determination as well as incredible humanity, thought, well, this is not good enough. So he brought fresh charges against most of the original perpetrators. The second judge was absolutely emphatic that this was a horrific crime, crying out to heaven for justice. The jury did convict, and 7 white men were hanged for the murder of black people. This is back in 1838. So while there was an act of indescribable horror perpetrated on these innocent Aboriginal people, in this particular instance, British justice did its work. And that was because of Governor Gipps, Attorney General Plunkett, and a system which, for all its failings, appreciated that in the end Aboriginal people were no less British subjects than the settlers. Now, Plunkett, very interesting character. Plunkett was an Irish Catholic, and at a time when Catholics were still under disabilities in Britain, he was appointed Attorney General here in New South Wales, and he did his best here in the Myall Creek case. And then some years later, a rascal, a villain called Coots up near Grafton, was responsible, it seems, for a poisoning of some 20 Indigenous people. Again, Plunkett investigated, brought Coots to trial for Sydney. In this instance, though, no conviction could be secured because in those days, Aboriginal people were thought, being non-Christian, to be incapable of swearing on a Bible and therefore giving testimony in court. Well, Plunkett tried to get the law changed so that Coots could be brought to justice. He lost 10-9 in the Legislative Council, and his contemporaneous notes say, look, as a result of this deficiency in the law, it seems that an atrocious crime will go unpunished. But a few years later, this was rectified. So even at a time of prejudice, discrimination, and even, dare I say it, racism, even at a time when on the frontiers of settlement, yes, some horrible, ugly things were taking place, there was also decency, benevolence, goodwill, and an attempt to do the right thing. And at all times on the frontier, the explorers would not have been able to discover, in inverted commas, what was new to British Australian eyes, but for the Aboriginal guides that they had. The squatters would not have been able to work the land, but for the assistance of Aboriginal stockmen and shepherds and so on. So from the very beginning, the story of Australia has been a story of cooperation and partnership as well as of conflict.
Just to draw out something you said, which was very, very significant, you made the point that Plunkett recognised that the law, if you like, saw those victims of that horrendous Myall Creek massacre, which was in the electorate that I represented for a long time in the federal parliament, were subjects of the British Crown. They were not classified as flora and fauna.
Of course not. Of course
We
not.
need to nail this. You only have to go a quick check and you find out that one of the things, great myths that our kids are being taught is not true. Here's another little sort of factoid in the midst of it all. Here in New South Wales, the biggest state, Indigenous men, because only men had the vote in those days, Australia was the first country in the world to legislate for female suffrage in South Australia. New Zealand, ironically, got to an election where they allowed women to vote before Australia, but the first legislation was here. But in this state, Indigenous men could vote while America was still keeping black men as slaves. Exactly right.
Exactly right. I mean, we have forgotten, because we don't study our history in depth and in a universal way, we have forgotten that within less than a century of the first bedraggled group of convicts and soldiers being dumped on the other side of the world here, within a century we had become a democratic pioneer, a great liberal laboratory of freedom, with the world's highest standard of living. And yes, that was in part because of our natural blessings of gold and soil and vast land areas, but it was also because of the fundamental decency of the civilisation that came ashore from 1788. I mean, Britain, at the end of the 18th century, was the Britain of Wilberforce and Shaftesbury. It was the Britain that was coming to realise the horrors of the slave trade. You know, it was the Britain of Lord Justice Mansfield, who said that the air of England is too pure for any slave to breathe. I mean, the Britain of those periods was probably the most enlightened place on earth at that time, and that was the spirit that moved at least the best of the people who made early modern Australia.
So in 1811 or 12, I think it was, General Lachlan Macquarie and his wife Elizabeth, supporters of Wilberforce and the anti-slavery movement, arrive here in this city where we are now. Macquarie Street's just down there below us. And you paint a picture of him as somebody who was deeply imbued with a sort of spirit of egalitarianism and concern for the underdog and for a just society.
Completely correct. And while it was in Macquarie's time that detachment that was ultimately responsible for the Abbott Massacre took place, Macquarie also opened a school at Parramatta for Aboriginal people, and one of the graduates of that school ultimately became a very significant landowner here in early Sydney. Macquarie instituted an annual feast for the leaders of the various Indigenous clans. Macquarie also started Foundation Day, which was the beginning of the Australia Day celebration. I think 1818, the 30th anniversary, was the first Australia Day, called Foundation Day back then. And, you know, when Macquarie and Elizabeth left, they were seen off by basically the whole of the population of Sydney at the time, because he was rightly regarded as, if you like, the father of Australia. It was in his time that the term Australia started to come into general use as a description of the continent.
He'd been a general in India, where his best friend and personal surgeon was John Anderson.
Well, I never.
And John Anderson's nephew, Dr. Colin Anderson, also an army doctor, was my forebear who came here. So I traced my heritage in this country to Lachlan Macquarie and his wife. Now, here's an interesting little story about the Macquaries. They actually bought 2 slaves in the slave markets in Calcutta when he was in India. For what purpose? To set them free, to let them go, to practice what they preached as supporters of Wilberforce's. One took his freedom. The other one is buried if that's the word, interned in their little mausoleum on the Isle of Mull off the west coast of Scotland. He was so trusted by Macquarie.
He went back to Scotland with the Macquaries.
Ahead of them.
Right.
To buy a field for them to buy a house on, and it's still known as Jarvis's Field. And the interesting thing about that is that Macquarie left here because he was an emancipist. He set the prisoners free, so to speak, and when they'd done their time, they were fully welcomed back into society. There were many influential people already in the colony who thought that was a bad idea. If you'd been a crim, yeah, all right, you did your time, but you weren't welcomed back into the community. Given a grant of land, 30 acres, those sorts of things, this idea of home ownership was and land ownership, very deeply enmeshed with the spirit of egalitarianism in early Australia. But the wealthy and the influential, many of them disliked it. So Macquarie went home under a cloud to be investigated, and it was quite a while before he was cleared. And in fact, he died before he was given a pension. It was then granted to his wife. So they were rough times. You had to have a fair bit of courage.
Exactly right. And it was precisely because so many of the convicts wrote back to their relatives in England to say what a wonderful life they had developed for themselves in Australia, that the British government thought, well, actually, transportation is supposed to be a punishment, not a reward, and we need to reinstall the horror of transportation, and that was why Commissioner Bigg was sent out towards the end of Macquarie's time to do the investigation, which was quite critical. I mean, it wasn't uniformly critical of Macquarie's administration, but it was quite critical. So you're right, John. Macquarie, in his lifetime, did not get the plaudits that he deserved. But again, let's remember the Britain of those times. For all its faults, this was the Britain that established the West Africa Squadron of the Royal Navy, which was responsible for the cessation of the transatlantic slave trade. For all of the contemporary angst in Britain about the British Empire, it was, in many respects, an empire of justice, and the stamping out of the slave trade is something that contemporary Britons do not give themselves sufficient credit for.
I've often thought that if you're a poor, unfortunate slave on a ship on the Triangle on the way out, living in the most appallingly horrible circumstances, chained up on a ship, rolling around your own bodily waste and that of your neighbours and what have you, and a Royal Navy ship stops you and frees you, and in fact many died in that work, white British Navy sailors, I don't think you'd be accusing them of being terrible racists.
No, exactly right. I mean, at a time when slavery was universal outside of Western Europe, Britain spent a very significant percentage of its national income on the Royal Naval squadrons that stamped it out, at least the transatlantic slave trade. And then, of course, there were the soldiers and missionaries in Africa who did their best to stamp out the African slave trade internally as well.
Tony, I have to say that I worry about the fragmentation, the atomization, and frankly, the level of hostility now between some of the identity groups in Australia, between and within broader culture. When politicians appeal to Australian values, I sometimes wonder what they mean, because an awful lot of them, frankly, play to our differences, not the things we have in common now.
I think that's a fair point, and I really dislike identity politics because, as our former leader used to often say, the things that unite us should always be more important than anything that divides us. For me, what is at the heart of what we like to think of Australian values and the broad concept of mateship, for instance, was something that emerged from the very beginning of modern Australia when, as I say, 1,500 bedraggled souls were dumped on the other side of the earth in a land that it took them quite a while to start to make sense of. Everyone had to muck in together. And I think that gave particular power to that gospel idea, if you like, or the golden rule, if you like, treat others as you would have them treat you. I think that has been probably better assimilated in Australia than almost in any other country.
One of the famous stories I remember learning about Governor Phillip and the early settlement was that when it ran very short on food, as a farmer I've never been able to understand why that happened, but it did. The governor himself put himself on the
Short
same rations as everyone else, the convicts, the lot.
Marines were hanged for stealing food. Convicts were hanged for stealing food. It was the same treatment for everyone, regardless of their position. And likewise, fast forward 150 odd years, unlike in the British Army, officers and men, they just messed in together. No Australians were shot for desertion in either war. Again, it was this idea that we were all in it together. No distinctions of rank or class.
Now, you've commented that there are three elements of Australian shaping, if you like, Indigenous heritage, its British foundation, and its immigrant category.
Character.
Or character, rather. You'd have to say, though, that I think we've been overwhelmingly a British society, and that's been our cultural laws and our anchoring, the institutions you touched on earlier. Because of this lack of understanding of our history, though, I don't think we live in a culture anymore where people appreciate the effort that went into them, how carefully thought through and argued and fought over the institutions of our freedom actually were. In fact, I think they are beginning to even doubt the beliefs and values that drove the building up of those institutions of freedom.
That's an interesting point, John. I mean, I think that to this very day, notwithstanding successive waves of non-British migration, particularly in the post-war period, we are still overwhelmingly an Anglo-Celtic society. We're not as ethnically Anglo-Celtic as we were, but I think we're still very much culturally Anglo-Celtic. And overwhelmingly, our foundational ethos remains, as I hope it always will, Judeo-Christian. Every migrant has come here voluntarily. Since the convicts, there has not been a single person who was forced to come to Australia. So all of those people who are currently coming to Australia from all over the world, India, China, Nepal, wherever, the Philippines, they are choosing to come here. And at least implicitly, they are choosing to come to what is fundamentally an Anglo-Celtic culture. So I think we do our migrants no favours when we connive at changing the culture and the ethos which they have found attractive. I think we owe it to the migrants as much as we owe it to fourth, fifth and sixth generation Australians to preserve the culture. And when we think of the citizenship pledge or oath that everyone is supposed to take, from this time forward under God, I pledge my allegiance to Australia and its people, whose democratic beliefs I share, whose rights and liberties I respect, and whose laws I will uphold and obey. We've got to take that seriously. We've got to take that seriously. Those who are conferring citizenship must take that seriously. Those who are adopting citizenship must take that seriously. And I think that should effectively perpetuate the broadly Anglo-Celtic culture that we have enjoyed these last 2 centuries.
Now, let's move then to, if you like, the broad sort of scope of the book without revealing too much. We want people to actually go and buy and read it, give it away for Christmas presents, disseminate it widely amongst young people so they've got some idea of what's really happened for good and for bad, so they can make informed judgments about whether our culture's worth fighting for and standing up for. You argue, broadly speaking, that for the first century or so, our progress was absolutely unbelievable. It was quite staggering.
Incandescently successful.
In many ways, what reminds me of this, I come from the country, as you know, and the number of high-quality old courthouses, schoolhouses, etc., railway stations that were built, usually with public monies, it has to be said, from the 1860s, 70s and 80s are extraordinary. You then had a pretty serious economic downturn and the horrific millennial drought, which kind of stunted things.
Followed by the Great War, the Depression and the Second World War.
But something interesting happens before the First World War. Anyway, you think you can actually trace the years when we've done incandescently well, as you put it, and the years when we haven't done so well?
Well, there are the periods of exuberance and there are the periods of introspection. The first century was exuberant beyond our wildest dreams. Then, as you say, we had the crash of the 1890s that probably impacted Australia more than any other place. We then had the horrific Federation drought, probably our worst ever. We then had the Great War, the Depression and the Second World War. But notwithstanding the crash and the drought, the 1890s was also the period of federation.
Yeah.
Just about every country on earth has been the product of wars, invasions, insurrections, revolutions. Our national existence was the product of none of those things. It was the product of a substantial cohort of influential public figures. It was their discussion, it was their negotiations, it was their compromise, and ultimately it was the democratic vote of the people which produced the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Australia. So our country, almost uniquely amongst the countries of the earth, has evolved through peaceful cooperation, compromise and consensus, which again I think is an extraordinary tribute to our forebears and a wonderful foundation upon which we should be building. And the fact that the Constitution that they created and which was formally promulgated at the turn of the last century has been so serviceable and has been so accepted by the public that we've only changed it in very small ways on a couple of relatively insignificant matters. Again, it's a tribute to the quality of their work.
So you powerfully and rightly make the point that blood was not shed in the way that was in so many other cultures to reach some sort of accommodation. In our case, a very good one, very thoughtfully put down by giants. We actually demean ourselves as a people when we don't recognise what they did. But having peacefully set this up, they then recognise that the world is looking very dangerous. So they set out very deliberately to say, well, we will defend our freedom if necessary in blood. So a little nation of just what, 5.5 million people?
Less than 5 million people at the time of the start of the First World War.
Well, in about 1905, 6, 7, realising how troubled the world is becoming, on a bipartisan basis, it's recognised that we need to do more to make sure that peace or that what we have here can be preserved if everything goes to custard.
Correct. With the support of the Labor Party, it was the Deakin administration, the Deakin government, which first passed the compulsory military service legislation for domestic military service, not foreign military service. And it was Deakin, with the support of Fisher, and it was Fisher who subsequently continued it. It was Deakin who decided that Australia needed a navy of its own. It was Deakin who encouraged the American Navy, the so-called Great White Fleet, to visit Sydney, Melbourne and Albany on its circumnavigation of the globe, which as well provided a lot of the motivation and encouragement for the formation of the Royal Australian Navy. So our forebears were conscious not just of the wonders that they had helped to create here in the Antipodes, but they were also conscious of the fact that a bounteous country like this needed to be able to defend itself, particularly in company with its great partners and allies. And I guess it was because our forebears were conscious of being part of a wider family that Fisher, as opposition leader, pledged to stand by the motherland to the last man and the last shilling at the outbreak of the Great War, and why Menzies, at the outbreak of the Second World War, said that Britain has declared war in consequence of Germany's invasion of Poland, and therefore Australia was at war. And while there was some disagreement in the Second World War about the dispatch of the Second Australian Imperial Force, there was no disagreement from the Labor Party about Australia being involved in that war to protect the freedom of the wider world, because there was a universal consciousness back then, as indeed there should be today, that Australia cannot readily survive as a free and sovereign nation in the absence of a global order that is supportive of free and independent sovereign nations.
Again, history is a great guide, I suspect, to, the sort of policies we ought to adopt. Because having confronted that unstable world, having introduced compulsory national service, agreed to by both sides of politics, ordering up a navy, and the legislation was actually finally passed by Fisher, a Labor Prime Minister. That navy was powerful enough, people overlook this, to secure our homeland from the might of the German Asian fleet.
Most people have forgotten that the first engagements of the Great War for us it wasn't Gallipoli, it was the conquest of German New Guinea, and then, of course, the Anzac convoy on its way across to Egypt, and they thought initially to Europe. It was the detachment of the HMAS Sydney from that convoy that resulted in the destruction of the Emden. And we surprised ourselves that we were a naval country as well as a pastoral country.
It's interesting history. What do you think was the significance of Anzac? I mean, if you go and talk to modern-day Turks, they're very friendly to Australians, but they will say, why do you celebrate Anzac Day? You lost the war, and there are only 8,000 of your people killed. We lost several hundred thousand. But nonetheless, you lost, we won. Why do you celebrate it? What's its significance as you see it?
Well, because it was a story of great human endurance, striving, sacrifice in a good cause. I mean, the important thing for Australia of Anzac was not so much whether we won or lost the battle, but whether we gave a good account of ourselves as a nation and as individuals. And overwhelmingly, there was this very powerful sense that the Australian soldier, individually and collectively, was a mighty person. And I guess the phrase of Beans in his official history, that their example rises, as it will always rise, above the mists of ages, a monument to great-hearted men, and for their nation a possession forever. I mean, that was overwhelmingly the contemporary feeling about the Australian soldiers of the Great War. Now, Gallipoli was a heroic failure. We have a much less distinct folk memory of the Australians on the Western Front, where in fact we won, or we spearheaded, a terrible victory. I mean, with the Canadians, we were thought to have been the shock troops of the British Empire, the best units of the British Army. It was Lloyd George who said of Monash that he was the most resourceful general in the British Army, a citizen soldier, an engineer by profession and training, who carefully studied the modern forms of warfare, which I suppose the cavalrymen that dominated the British Army were perhaps not quite as diligent in. And it was Monash who is thought to have perfected the all-arms warfare, which enabled, in the end, the British forces to break the stalemate on the Western Front and bring history's most horrific war to a reasonably swift close in 1918. And we've almost entirely forgotten that. I mean, one of the reasons, John, why as Prime Minister I was so keen to establish the Monash Centre at Villers-Bretonneux was to remind Australians that it wasn't just Gallipoli, it was also the Western Front that we were hugely involved in and invested in during the Great War. And now tens of thousands of Australians every year are visiting the Monash Centre and hopefully being reminded of that.
You touched on Australia's formation taking place at a time of enormous ferment over belief in Great Britain. And you mentioned Wilberforce. When Wilberforce entered the Parliament in Britain, it's believed that there were only one or two other believing as opposed to church-going Christians. By the time he left the Parliament shortly before he died, it's estimated that around 35 to 40% of the English Parliament were card-carrying evangelicals. The influence for humanitarianism, you mentioned Shaftesbury and so forth, was enormous. It's played out much more in this country, I think, than we in our modern secular state of mind tend to think. And to give you an interesting little example, the first time the Labor Party ran as an organised party in New South Wales, which was the biggest state, of course, pre-Federation, I think was 1891, thereabouts, and a little over 30 members were elected. Over 20 of them were from the dissident, if you like, evangelical branches of the church, the Methodists, the Free Presbyterians, the Congregationalists. They were stump preachers. They had a deep commitment to social justice. I think we often overlook how much we owe people of Christian faith and their endeavours to create a better world, imperfect and naive and failed as some of those efforts might have been. It's more to do with our national character than we give it credit for.
I think you're right, John. I mean, I think the phrase was Christian socialism. I mean, a lot of those early Labor activists and leaders were very devout, and it was in part, at least, their Christianity that motivated their concern for the betterment of the worst off people in society, the worker who in those days was not necessarily that well educated and certainly was not protected by law in the same way that the worker has subsequently become. Look, I think Western civilization generally, let alone the English-speaking version of it, is unimaginable without Christian faith. This idea that every human being is made in the image and likeness of God, I think is the foundation of our basic structure of human rights. I think this idea that, there is neither slave or free, male or female, Gentile or Jew, I think is the foundation of our concept of the equality of human beings. And I know we are a bit post-Christian these days. Hopefully we might remember more of this part of our inheritance too. But I think that any suitably thoughtful and knowledgeable Australian needs to at least appreciate the role that Christianity has had in the way our society has evolved and in the things that we now so much take for granted and which I fear are perhaps under more challenge now than they have been for quite some time.
See, I think it's allowed for an environment of historical revisionism, which has not served us well. So you've had several decades now of historians who have essentially argued that history ends in the rightness of, if you like, Labor Party politics. You actually argue something quite different, that Australia's been a great experiment in true liberalism.
Correct. And it's interesting, isn't it, how the different strands of liberalism have developed. In New South Wales, we had, if you like, the classic small government liberalism. In Victoria, there was a strand of big government statist liberalism. Both strands were interested in human flourishing and in individual self-actualisation, but the statist strand emphasised the role of the state in bringing that about or facilitating that, whereas the more classically liberal strand felt that actually the government that governs best is normally the government that governs least, and most allows the individual to get on with things. Now, I think there are arguments on both sides of that particular divide. I'm instinctively New South Welsh in this as opposed to Victorian, particularly given that the individual, as time went by, was better educated, was better resourced, was less readily intimidated by his or her betters. But from the very beginning of modern Australia, there was this strong strand of egalitarianism. I mean, the idea that Jack's as good as his master, always very strong in Australia. It's interesting how many of the convicts came off the ship, were almost immediately given tickets of leave because they had skills that were needed for the colony to develop. I mean, the official that greeted Governor Macquarie, given that Governor Bligh had been, as it were, packed off into a form of house arrest, the official who greeted Governor Macquarie when he arrived was actually an ex-convict. We had ex-convict magistrates, we had ex-convict police. And yes, as you said, there was the division between the emancipists and the so-called exclusives, represented by people like John MacArthur, who didn't like the social position that people like Macquarie were happy to accord to the ex-convicts. But again, this has all gone into the making of modern Australia.
I think it's so important that we understand this. It makes us unique. Liberalism, you've highlighted how liberalism in Sydney was different to liberalism in Melbourne, in Victoria. That is true. And the liberalism really of Deakin and even of Menzies is different to the liberalism that you and I were part of, I think, under John Howard. And now you're seeing a new liberalism, or a new, at least on the conservative end of liberalism, if I can use that loosely, you're seeing a bit of a drift back towards the idea that security and social outcomes have to be weighed heavily, or as heavily as free trade and laissez-faire economics, crudely put, partly because of the security argument.
Yeah, look, I don't accept this idea that government should be significantly interfering in every aspect of the economy. I think that an iron law of economics, which we've seen manifested time and time again in many, many different places, is that you can't tax your way to prosperity, you can't subsidise your way to prosperity. There are certain areas where government must be involved. National security, obviously. There are some industries and capabilities that are essential for national security. But beyond that, what government should be doing is keeping taxes as low as possible, keeping the regulatory burden as light as possible, and trusting to the entrepreneurial instincts of the citizen to produce the maximum prosperity. I should also make this point, though. It should be character that keeps people doing the right thing much more than law. It dismays me that in the pursuit of short-term profits, so many of our businesses have subcontracted out so many parts of our critical supply chains to, for argument's sake, communist China. But I don't think it should be government that stops them doing it. It should be their character and their good sense, which ought to say, well, actually, even if I can get this done 10% more cheaply in China than I can in Australia, out of respect for my fellow Australians and out of a desire to make sure that we have control of what's going on that impacts greatly on us, we'll keep doing it in Australia. I mean, I was listening to an American senator recently, and this person, who's heavily involved with defence contracting, was saying that for the last 15 years or so, big American defence contractors have been putting Chinese components into important bits of American military hardware. Well, it shouldn't take the government to stop this. These people, out of their own patriotism and common sense, should have been thinking, surely it's not smart of us to be putting into our vital military hardware something that could be cut off instantaneously in the event of tension with our emerging geopolitical competitor.
These are very difficult issues. I mean, I've always subscribed to economic liberalism as a broad concept and have fought for it and argued for it. And indeed, in my days in politics, so were the peak farm bodies, which is interesting. But now we're confronted with a reality. What do we do about the fact that if you really look objectively at national security, we are a massive food producer and exporter and fibre producer and exporter, but we're totally dependent on imported oil, imported fertiliser and imported chemicals. They're not made here anymore. And so the idea that we're food secure, I have to tell you as a farmer, is a tenuous hope if anything goes wrong. But we're not preparing for it. And so these are not issues that the country should avoid, but we are avoiding them.
Well, one of the things that I thought was screamingly obvious in the early days of the pandemic was that in an emergency, at least for a time, it's going to be every country for itself. You might remember that we had ordered and paid for vaccines, for instance, from Europe. And one of our friends in Europe basically decided that they weren't going to let us have them. Now, I think we do need a comprehensive national audit. What is necessary to maintain life here in Australia, both ordinary life and the life that might be needed at a time of national emergency? So what do we have to be able to make in Australia? What do we have to stockpile in Australia? What are we prepared to rely on our friends for? What are we prepared to rely on the rest of the world for? I mean, we need to do some serious thinking about all of this, because that benign world that we thought would last for all time, or some people thought would last for all time in the wake of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of Soviet communism, if it ever existed, it certainly doesn't exist now.
Well, Tony, I think your book is a towering achievement. I can't recommend it strongly enough. Let me just conclude by asking you this question. Are we still the lucky country?
Of course we are. Notwithstanding the fact that we might be a little distracted, a little divided, and a little disappointed with ourselves in more recent times. And I do think, in a sense, we have been drifting backwards over the last few years. We still have we've got a wonderful natural environment. We've got tremendous natural advantages. We have a society which, compared with others, is still cohesive and contented. Yes, of course we're the lucky country. And the fact that hundreds of thousands of people are clamouring to join us every year is an extraordinary vote of confidence in us. And we should accept that as a vote of confidence. We should, I guess, remember our great strengths and be more determined than ever to build on them.
Tony Abbott, thank you very much.
Thank you, John.